So the hot topic of the moment is the 3310, the famous Nokia phone that has become so known for its sturdiness, battery life, reliability, and kind of come to represent the simpler time of mobile phones from the early 2000s before all these smartphones and smart watches and smart cameras and smart computers. Well, computers have always been pretty smart, but still. Now, the rumor of the moment is that Nokia plans to re-release the 3310, redesigning it as a budget burner phone, playing off nostalgia of early Nokia phones and capitalizing on the 3310's now mythical online reputation. So between all these videos and articles talking about how great the Nokia was and waxing lyrical on pre-smartphone nostalgia without probably having picked one up for the best part of a decade, it just so happens that I have been using a Nokia 3310 as my main phone for about a month now. Well, actually what I own is a Nokia 3330, which came out in 2001. It is the WAP enhanced version, the version that came with basic internet browsing capabilities and a few other features like being able to add up to 100 numbers into the phone book built into the phone itself rather than just the SIM on the 3310, as well as an extra game and a few other basic features. For all intents and purposes though, it is almost identical to the 3310 and operates in the same way, and for that reason I'll be referring to it as a 3310 throughout the review because it is easier to say 3310 than 3300 in my weird mouth. Now, I am not some technological hermit or an electronics hipster. Well, I kind of am. I've got quite a lot of reel-to-reel players in my house, but this phone has actually sat in my van or my boat or my backpack as a kind of backup phone for quite a few years now, and since my Sony Xperia decided to brick itself, I have fallen back to Old Faithful here as my main handset. But because of this, in some ways, I think I am uniquely positioned to provide a review or certainly a rundown of how I found using the 3310 in more modern times and maybe do a sort of retro review of the thing. So let's start at the top of the Nokia 3310 tick list. Sturdiness. The 3310 comes preloaded with some stereotypes, the most well-known being its apparent indestructibility. Amazon reviews and various articles reminiscing about the phone will talk about how it can survive any and all forms of punishment, but to be honest, both at the time and now, the 3310 never really came off in my eyes as super tough. It certainly has a good design to brush off scrapes and bumps. It's got these nice round edges. It's got this nice small 84x48 monochrome display that's recessed into the phone so that if something slams down on it from the top, it's not going to directly hit the screen. But the phone itself can come off sometimes feeling a little bit hollow. The back plate on this particular phone has always felt a little bit loose even when it was new, and the phone has a tendency to creak a bit when you move it back and forth. The rubber button on the top here has also been a little bit smooshed over the years. Now, the fact that this is in my hands in such good working order gives it some points, as it's probably the oldest and the best preserved of all the old mobile phones in my house, but it also probably has something to do with the fact this originally belonged to my mother, and she keeps her phones in such immaculate condition that her recently replaced iPhone 4 still looks absolutely brand new. Now, under the hood here, you have this battery and SIM. This is actually a replacement battery that I bought along with a replacement charger, and interestingly, it's the same charging block, it's the same plug as the replacement charger that I bought for my PSP, so I'm starting to think there is just a large warehouse full of these out in China and they're just swapping out all the correct chargers that are needed for each and every device. But the original battery is here and it still works perfectly well. In fact, it still achieves a good few days charge, and I usually carry it around in my hiking bag as a bit of a backup. Now, to get at the SIM, you've got these satisfying little buttons that you pop out and voila, the SIM card appears after the battery goes flying out of your face. You can actually see here there's a micro SIM that I've placed in an adapter to get it working on an old SIM slot. So putting it back together again and powering it on, you've got a quick little boot time, you've got an optional message, you've got to remember to reset the time and date, and like that you're onto the home screen. Now, pressing down brings you to the phone book, and you can just press the center button to make a call. It's nice and easy, but we'll go into the menu and see all the settings. Something I loved at the time was that each menu item has its own wee animation, which is still pretty neat. Starting from the top, you've got the phone book, messages, chat, call register, tones, settings, call divert, games, calculator, reminders, clock, profile services, and Vodafone or whoever your provider is. Now, the chat function is something I never used, but I wanted to mention it because I'd kind of forgotten about what this actually was. You can create essentially a small chat screen like you'd find on a more modern smartphone, or a more conversational text screen. Now, it's a feature, like I said, I've never used, and it takes some setting up to do, and you can't really save your conversations, but it's very interesting to see on such an old phone, and it feels much more like a primitive version of something like Messenger or WhatsApp, and it's probably kind of where they got their inspiration from it. The regular text program is fine, the keyboard is nice to use, and the predictive text works pretty well once you're used to it, but the 3310 had a couple of annoying features in the text sending department. For one, you couldn't see sent text unless it was an unsent text, maybe in your outbox, and what's more, once a text had sent, you'd get this nice little text sent animation, but you'd then be thrown back into the text screen with no other indication that the text had actually sent. I remember very well sending a few texts at a time, as one, I was unsure if they were sent, and two, I didn't didn't want to have to rewrite it, as once you exit out of the screen, the text is lost as there is no drafts function. Funnily enough, you can actually send picture images on this, but these are limited only to the images and wallpapers on the phone itself. So if you wanted to send a text of a cake on someone's birthday or a picture of a panda for some reason, I guess you were fine, but otherwise it was a bit of a waste of money and credit. At one time, you could probably have downloaded or bought more pictures from your service provider, but none of these services will be working anymore. It's also worth noting that these image messages are not going to work anymore. It might work if you send it to another 3310 phone, but if you send it to anything pre-smartphone or post-smartphone nowadays, you're going to get an unreadable text that just arrives in their inbox and can't be opened or can't be displayed properly. Now, the other thing I wanted to cover was tones. You can make up custom ringtones using a neat little MIDI composer. And as you can see here, there's some songs that my sister and I made up back when this thing was actually my mum's main mobile phone 15 odd years ago. In your settings, you can arrange pin locks, welcome notes, call settings and all that. You can also make up profiles. Now, smartphones usually just come with silent, regular, and maybe a do not disturb, but on the 3310, you can make up silent, loud, general, discreet, or your own custom ones for different situations. Maybe if you were, I don't know, an undertaker and you wanted to switch between your custom, mournful, self-composed MIDI ringtones and your general settings for at home with the kids. That's just an example. I don't know how many undertakers actually own this phone. You could also change between the preset wallpapers, which were just as random as they are memorable and are the same pictures that you can send in a picture message, like a beach or a weird sun or bouncing heads or just the Nokia logo. I don't really know what they were thinking there. Now, games is where I spent most of my youth when I had stolen this thing off one of my parents, and it's probably still the best part of the phone. The 3310 came loaded with Snake 2, not the original Snake, as a lot of places mistakenly mention. Bumper, which is basically pinball, Bantumi, which I never really figured out, Pairs 2, which is a card game, and Space Impact. Now, Space Impact is a brilliant game. It's a kind of Galaxian side-scrolling shoot-'em-up where you progress through various well-designed levels, taking out a variety of Space Invader-like ships using special weapons and power-ups. There's a well-designed boss, there's cool cityscapes, there's neat weapons, and it's a perfect game for whiling away hours upon hours at a bus station or when you're on a train. It's also a pretty novel feature nowadays to be able to burn through 4 or 5 hours of a mobile game and not have your phone battery dead before lunchtime. Now, the call quality, well, to be honest, I'm never somebody who's been that fussy when it comes to call quality, and when I first dug out the phone, I wasn't expecting much, but for the life of me, I struggled to notice much improvement in my modern smartphone over the 3310. Sure, the speaker is a little bit more tinny on the 3310, but it's comfortable against your head. It doesn't get all horrible and sweaty, unlike having that big bit of glass clamped to your face on a hot day. And as someone who has an old GPO rotary dial phone that I rewired as the main house phone, you can actually go and watch a wee video of me doing that on my second channel. The quality is perfectly manageable. In fact, I've had more complaints about sound issues on my Xperia and my iPhone than I've ever had on the Nokia itself. Now, out and about, the phone performs pretty well. I've had this at sea, I've had this while driving and camping on the camper van, I've had this while out hiking in the hills. It has got soaked through, it has got burnt under the sun. At one point it got dropped onto a very messy deck full of fish guts, and it still worked perfectly fine. And as you can see, it must have wiped off quite well because there's no blood stains, which would have looked very suspicious if I brought this out in a public place. The screen is pretty clear, even in direct sunlight. The buttons are easy to use, and I actually find it a wee bit easier to send a text in the biting cold than I do with a smartphone nowadays. It is slightly unnerving that the screen never really turns off though, as nowadays any screen staying on is going to drain your battery on a smartphone, or in the case of a lot of Android phones, burn an image onto the screen. The backlight is also really decent. You can see it in the full dark here, and it makes the keys really clear when you're texting at night or in bed. It's also good because the low dim light is a nicer light to wake up to than when you accidentally turn on the smartphone on full brightness at night and kind of get your entire retina burned off. In the end, the problem with talking about these phones and revisiting the 3310 in particular is that it's all blurred by either nostalgia or misunderstanding why someone would actually want one of these phones, either the original or this potential re-release in present day. For all the talk about people going on about how these phones were brilliant, they were all they ever needed, they weren't complicated in today's nature and all this kind of stuff, even your most old-fashioned of smartphone user, I think, would probably struggle to readjust to this phone. Not to mention the fact that this phone isn't even perfect in the things it can do. Texting can be a bit of a nightmare, not knowing if a text is sent and when it's sent. The clunky text navigation screen can be a pain to read sometimes. The phone lacks features and usability that was built into future devices, and sure, you miss the ability to take a photo or play music at the drop of a hat. So a lot of these articles talking about how perfect the Nokia 3310 is, maybe I would say to them is actually use the phone a bit and then decide whether today's society has kind of gone to the wayside and everyone should just turn back to using old pre-smartphone phones. I do find it a bit funny, for example, in this Observer article, that the joy of the 3310 apparently was texts, and that texting is more real and serious than an email and has more weight somehow, when only 10 years previously texts were being touted as the downfall of society and the death of proper face-to-face conversations. However, on the other end of the scale, we've got things like this article from Stuff magazine and a kind of counterpoint talking about how terrible the 3310 is. There's things like, you can't get Uber on it, you'll be disconnected from the outside world, it's hard to type, you can't get Google Maps. Well, yeah, I guess, but that's a bit silly, isn't it, as a point? I think it goes to highlight the bigger digital divide that's forming these days. Not everyone wants all those features. Do you think anyone's getting one of these thinking they can get an Uber on it? I've never even used Uber. This phone is for when I'm hiking in the hills of Scotland, or when, shocker, I just want a reliable phone for making calls and texts only. Some people do want and need the basic, and as I've found out, I've enjoyed walking around a lot more without the constant buzzing and chirping from the bloody emails or Twitter, or just mindlessly browsing Reddit. Even when sitting in a cafe or buying a newspaper now, I'm distracted by just mindless browsing, but you probably won't find that on the Nokia even with space impact. So in the end, can I recommend the Nokia 3310 or the 3330? You can pick these up online pretty cheap. Don't let the news report talking about how the prices have shot up fool you. You can find working handsets for £10 to £15 online on either eBay or Amazon, and in fact search for the Nokia 3330. Like I say, it's almost identical, but because less people know about them, they're probably going to be a little bit cheaper. In the end though, are any of them worth picking up? Well, if you're like me and you're only needing it as a backup phone for whatever reason, then I wouldn't dissuade you. It's a nice phone with a decent weight behind it. It's maybe not the most sleek phone of the time, but certainly recognizable, and at the very least, it's a nice bit of phone history that still functions perfectly well as a calls and text mobile. I think one of the things that makes the 3310 so timeless is also due to the lack of a camera. In my personal opinion, the toughest standard phone out there was the Sony Ericsson K300, which was an absolute machine of a device that survived everything from falling off a 3-story building to falling off a pier and into the sea. But the god-awful camera and early internet capabilities have made that phone age so much worse than the older 3310. This phone survives and still serves a useful purpose because the features it has have not yet been eclipsed. If you're looking for a phone that purely deals with calls and text, you're probably better at this point looking for a pre-camera phone device than anything else. The Nokia is simple. It does text, it does calls, and it has a few great games to keep you busy and some simple programs to call on if you're stuck. There's no now useless camera or extras like on the K300. It still succeeds in all the things it was built to do. One thing I would note, however, is that if you're from the United States, I would maybe not recommend getting one of these, or at least research buying some of these older phones. There's a lot of talk about 2G networks in the US being switched off, and so the lifespan of these phones might be affected by that. I don't know if all these phones are going to be working if they start turning off the 2G networks. The UK, however, has no such plans to ditch the 2G workhorse. The vast majority of calls in the UK are carried on the 2G networks, so you should be fine if you're buying an older device to use out on the hills like I am, or possibly on a cliffside, which I probably should have done when I was stranded like this. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and yeah, I'm gonna go make some calls on my Nokia 3330. Goodbye.